This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with corporate board member, and we are going to take an interesting look today at shareholder proposals and try and get an update on what's been happening in proxy voting and annual meetings. And it is my pleasure to welcome back a guest and an expert in this area, and that is James Copland, who is the director of the Manhattan Institute Center for Legal Policy. And most importantly, that the Institute is the sponsor of proxymonitor.org, which is a website sponsored, again, by the Manhattan Institute Center and sheds light on the influence of outside shareholder proposals on publicly traded companies. So, Jim, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, TK.
Well, you guys, it's such a great website that you're the right person to come back. And the first thing I thought we'd take a shot at, and it's funny, we've spent the last couple shows, we're either talking about compensation, risk oversight, or sort of proposals. And the reason is we're smack dab in proxy and annual meeting season.
It's that time of year.
So my first question to you is, what issues and trends are going to define the 2012 season as you're seeing it halfway through?
Well, we're really following four main things. First of all, we're going to track say on pay in the second full year and see how these votes turn out. ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services, the large proxy advisory firm, shifted its policy this year. They're basically saying if you get under 70% of the vote, they want to come back and talk to you. This is somewhat self-fulfilling because ISS last year on say on pay tended to affect the say on pay votes about 24-25% of the vote, which means it's going to be very hard for companies to get a 70% threshold if ISS is against you. So we're going to be interested to follow what's happening. The early returns so far, it looks like there's as much as a 30% hit on the big companies when ISS has come out against the executive compensation plan that's been backed. And of course, on April 17th, we saw Citigroup actually fail to get a majority support for its executive compensation plan. So we're going to keep watching that. And in terms of the shareholder proposals, we're basically tracking three different types. First, the political spending disclosure proposals, they keep growing in number. None of them have passed yet, but we're going to follow those trends and see how that evolves, especially with ISS now generally being for such proposals. Secondly, we're going to be looking at these chairman independence proposals. These are nothing new, separating the chairman and CEO position. But the labor unions have announced they're going to make a big push for it this year. We see some uptick in the introduction of these proposals. We're going to be following very closely how these votes turn out and how this looks. And then thirdly, we've sort of got a class of proposals which are new. It's sort of a test year for proxy access proposals. A lot of these have been getting excluded under 14A8, but we do see Wells Fargo on April 24th getting a proposal, the first big company getting such a proposal on the ballot. Want to follow these and see how they evolve, because now that the SEC's rule on proxy access was overturned by the DC Circuit, we expect to see a significant level of shareholder activity trying to make this a ballot issue in the future. So we want to follow it and see what's going on.
When you look at, because on the site people will see that you cover all the proposals there, and when you look at these and you look at the sponsors, talk a little bit about what sort of sponsors of these proposals have gotten traction, sort of what ones are sort of single interest and people know that and they haven't got much traction. Talk about the people that are people or groups that are putting up these proposals.
There are really three large groups putting up proposals. First are individuals, and 2/3 of the individual proposals come from four main corporate gadflies, so to speak. Evelyn Davis on the one hand, and then John Chevedden, members of the Steiner and Rossi families. Chevedden, Steiner, Rossi sort of file similar proposals across companies and seem to coordinate efforts. Evelyn Davis goes off on her own route. And then beyond that, you have labor union pension funds and other labor-related interests, and sort of social investors, either socially responsible investing funds, groups of nuns, Catholic orders, things like this, or public policy groups like the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Clearly, the more social policy-oriented proposals haven't been passing. None of them have passed. Actually, we had one pass over the 7 years of our database's history that we're tracking now among big companies. But by and large, these don't get approved by a majority of shareholders. So the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals tend not to have a lot of success. The labor unions do have some success, as do some of the individual corporate gadfly type proponents. But it really depends on what type of proposal you're talking about. And so those that are most successful are those backing the more popular types of proposals, notably those calling for majority voting for the election of directors, declassification of the board, and to some degree in recent years, calls to have special meeting powers for shareholders or written consent action by shareholders, where we've seen some of those passing. And really, some of the proponents will back those, and therefore they'll have more. John Chevedden, for instance, since 2006 at the Fortune 200, he's passed 23 out of his 93 proposals that he's introduced. Evelyn Davis, in contrast, who tends to introduce different types of proposals, has only passed 1 out of 140 proposals that she's introduced at the big companies. And that's largely a function of different types of proposals being sponsored. So at the big companies to date, we've seen 3 proposals pass. 2 were by labor unions, 1 by CalPERS, 1 by AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, and a 3rd by Gerald Armstrong, who's a social investor, introducing this as an individual. Each of those involved either majority voting or board declassification.
Yeah, and I guess we're seeing, particularly with that, with the majority voting, since most of the big companies have that, right, we're seeing that sort of introduced at the mid-cap and the small cap. So that's probably one of the significant trends, I would think, for 2012.
I think that's right. It's hard for us to pick it up in our database because we only follow the Fortune 200, but I think that's right. A lot of these proposals that have gotten traction already, been improved at the big company, the big companies have it. You're going to see more in the mid-cap company range.
When we look at this environment, is there anything that directors should be doing today, around this shareholder proposal? I mean, we've talked about shareholder communication, but we're in the middle of the fray now. Even though we saw Citicorp have, their annual meeting early, most of those are to come, so they're in the middle of the voting. Is there anything that boards should be doing today when you're in the middle of this process?
Well, I think clearly on the executive compensation questions, it pays to be active. So if ISS is coming out with a recommendation to vote no, it pays to respond. It pays to analyze what ISS has done, to bring up any issues in the analysis or the pay per performance model ISS is using to the extent that's possible. And beyond that, directors really need to know their shareholders. Who are your biggest shareholders? Communicate with those shareholders. Know if those shareholders are using ISS or Glass Lewis to determine how they're going to vote on these types of questions, and keep dialogue open. That's the best way to make sure that you're not going to get surprised in this process. And there will be times when you're going to be disappointed because your shareholders may disagree with your opinion.
While we have you on, there's something I have to ask you about. I saw in the news it might have even been CFO magazine that I saw, where there was a group, looked like a labor group, that had submitted something to the American Standards Institute, or I can't remember exactly what the definition of that is, but they were asking for what I would call the equivalent of disclosure on human capital, okay? But specifically, they talked in there about putting the pressure on organizations, and it made me immediately come to the thought process of what's following say on pay. Oh my God, could it be say on human capital? And what would be required? First of all, it looked like, why would you disclose some of this? Because it looked like your competition would love to know what you're talking about. But the point is, here we go. Here is something else that ends up with full disclosure. And somewhere, I mean, you just can't disclose everything. I know the skids are greased right now, but I mean, this is going to be bizarre.
Yeah, I think you could see something along these lines. If it's a say on disclosure, I think you could probably get that through on a 14A8 basis. I think if you actually wanted to have shareholders approve human capital or some sort of human resource management standards, that would be a business judgment question, I think, absent a statutory change, like we saw in Dodd-Frank. I mean, let's be clear, say on pay gained momentum, but what really put it over the top was a mandatory rule that Congress implemented in the Dodd-Frank legislation. I think absent a legislative shift like that, you'd have a hard time actually giving shareholders control over what are clearly management discretion types of issues. But when it comes to disclosure, the SEC's tended to be permissive. We see this with political spending. My guess is some of these could get green lighted, and it's really a tool, particularly that the labor union pension funds I would worry about might be using to try to gain negotiating leverage over management.
Yeah, I would say that's probably the case, but and I would see the companies and the chamber and them just rising up on this, because again, the foot's in the door. This is to me the equivalent of the leg. Okay, and I just hope that what I read was not something that's going to come to fruition.
A lot of traction.
But
well, we can hope.
Let me ask you this, Jim. What message would you give to directors today when we're looking at this proliferation of shareholder proposals? What recommendations would you give in both maybe limiting them, okay, if there's such a thing to be able to do, or certainly handling them when it happens? Right. You have enough experience in this.
I think they're separate questions, limiting them and managing them or handling them. Limiting them, I think the instinct of your sort of corporate secretary, corporate governance team is often going to be, let's try to limit these, keep these off the ballot. That's sort of their job. But if you're the director, your fiduciary duty is to the shareholder. And so the end game is not necessarily to keep them off the ballot, even though they may be a nuisance or create difficulties for you individually, but rather to make decisions that are in the best interest of the shareholder. And that's not always putting everything up for a shareholder vote, but sometimes you may want to fight back. But again, I think the key here is knowing your shareholders, communicating with them, understanding what the proxy advisory firms are doing, and trying to stay ahead of the game. Sometimes it might be in the shareholders' best interest to negotiate these types of proposals off the ballot. Some of these folks just want to be able to talk to you, but you shouldn't compromise your core business principles, because what you're really doing is trying to protect the shareholder, and that's your fiduciary duty as a director. And so if you think you've got the right executive compensation model, try to fight it and defend it. Now, obviously, if a majority of shareholders vote one way, then it becomes a different question. But at the outset, if you think your political spending strategy makes sense and disclosing it, at least some of the ways that it's being asked to be disclosed, certain types of disclosure are required and make sense. Fight back, because that's what your shareholders are asking you to do when you're a director, and you don't want to be captured by a sort of squeaky wheel, a large, loud activist group of minority shareholders that may actually be acting in a way that's detrimental to the average shareholder.
Yeah, and that's the point I think I would want to make in this, is that we can't talk about shareholder as a single entity, okay, unless there's some kind of vote that there is a blanket statement made, because when you take on the responsibility of representing the shareholders, you are representing a wide class of different types of shareholders, and what may be good for this group of shareholders isn't necessarily good for this group of shareholders, and that's where single interest issues sometimes have fallen on lack of support, and that's the way it should be. But that's what makes the job tough, is that the shareholders are not this single-minded group. It's a very diverse class of all kinds of different people with different interests, and that's why the duty of care is really I need to look at all the information and make the best decision that I can for the corporation and the corporation shareholders.
That's absolutely right, TK.
So, well, listen, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll always bring you back if you can give us a good update on what's happening in the annual meeting and shareholder proposal world. So, Jim, thanks for joining us. And that will conclude this week's edition of This Week in the Boardroom. Hope you enjoyed the session. We'll be back next week to take a look at another key topic that will help you be a better director and a better committee member. And we will see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.